Morning, everybody. Welcome to Time with the Bible Live. We have been going through the Gospels, looking at different events, different teachings in Jesus's life, and just thinking about some application for us as we're trying to be more like him as his disciples. We're trying to follow him. We have looked at John chapter 1 a couple weeks ago, and then we looked at John's announcement of Jesus just last week and kind of what happened with those events. I think it was 4 weeks ago, we looked at John chapter 2, talking about turning water into wine. And now we're going to look at an event that there's some debate about. And so we're going to talk about that. You may have had a question about why I put this. This was the first temple cleansing. We're going to talk about that a little bit here in a minute. We won't debate too much, but we'll talk about that here in just a second. And so we're going to be in John chapter 2. We're going to look there in verse 13. John 2 and verse 13. Let's go ahead and get into our study. I'm going to read this section. I'll read at least the first little part of it, and then we'll get into talking about it. So John chapter 2, verse 13, it says, "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money exchangers doing business. And when he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise.' And then his disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house has eaten me up.' And so the Jews answered and said to him, 'What sign do you show us since you do these things?' And Jesus answered and said, 'Destroy the temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' And then the Jews said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking of the temple of his body. And therefore, when he had raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said." All right, so in verse 12, it says that Jesus had gone up to Capernaum, and now when it's Passover, like a good Jewish man, Jesus goes down to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And see, in verse 13, he goes into the temple, and what does he find happening there in the temple? Well, lots of things that you wouldn't expect to find when you go into the temple, a place of worship, a place of prayer. You have these businessmen, and they're selling these oxen and these sheep. You have the money exchangers. You think about what this was. This was like a one-stop shop for worshipers. It was like a convenience store. You had people coming from all over, lots of different places from out of town, people coming from long distances, coming in to worship God. You can think about the convenience of that. You wouldn't have to travel with your animal for such a long distance. And also they were commanded to pay a temple tax. And so you had the money exchangers. I'm assuming the temple tax had to be in the coin of the Jews. So they would bring in their foreign coin and they would exchange it for the amount. You probably had these businessmen who were cheating, had lots of things that would happen back then, practices that you would have unbalanced scales and all kinds of things. So lots of problems with having a convenience store. But I don't know if that was even the biggest issue, is that people were buying things. I think maybe one of the biggest problems was the fact that this was probably something taking place in you'd have something taking place here in the court of the Gentiles, around the temple, around the holiest of place where God would dwell. You had lots of different courts in which people were allowed to go and enter and approach the presence of God. This was the closest that a Gentile could get. And you could imagine traveling all that way to go worship God, getting as close to God as you could possibly get, and having all this distraction going on. There was certainly a problem with having this within the temple, because how did Jesus feel about it? Well, he is fuming. He is outraged. And what does he do about it? Well, he starts throwing things around. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine being at your local Walmart and somebody coming in and just start overturning all the aisles and all the merchandise is just being thrown everywhere and all the screaming of the people as this is happening. You can imagine somebody walking into the church building, and they start overturning all the pews, and they turn over the Lord's Supper table, and you've got the bread and you've got the juice flying everywhere. And you can imagine what kind of chaos that would bring upon the temple. And he also makes a whip, and he drives the animals out. Could you imagine, as he's making the whip and he's cracking it, and the noise of the animals as they are scared, and the noise of the worshipers as they are screaming on their way out? He doesn't really sound like this doesn't really sound like something Jesus would do. But it's like he's a madman. It's like he's in this frenzy. So maybe the question we need to ask is, why is he so angry? Why is he doing this? Like, this isn't exactly the meek and mild Jesus that you would expect to find in the Gospels. So why did he do that? Could you imagine? I think one of the things I give an answer to this is that they are abusing his father's house. Could you imagine letting some people stay in your parents' house when they're out of town for a weekend or something, and they have a party and they're just trashing it? How would you feel about that? You get mad, you get angry, you'd run them out too. You'd be outraged. You'd resent them. And we kind of struggle with outrage, and we struggle with that kind of thing. But Jesus cared about his father. Jesus cared about the temple worship. He cared enough to do something here. And there's a couple of things I think we can learn from this specifically. Number one is to have that kind of zeal for God. Like, we need to learn to have a passion and a zeal for the God and the things of God. I think that's really important. But also, to not turn his house of prayer into something else. What's God's house today? Well, there's a couple different ways to answer that. Where does God dwell today? What is the temple of God today? We might be able to answer that by saying, well, we're the temple of God. Well, how outraged do you think Jesus gets when we put in so much junk into our lives, even despite the fact that he has cleansed our bodies? He's cleansed us of our sins. He bore our sins in his own body on the cross. How outraged do you think Jesus is when we are just inputting junk into our lives, when we're turning ourselves from his temple into this temple of merchandise, being sold to different things? I think that shows the seriousness of the cleansing of our lives and what God intends us to be. Jesus, surely he's outraged with those kinds of things. But also, you think about another thing that you would consider to be the temple, that would be the church. Would Jesus be outraged about many of the things that people put into the church today that he didn't command them to do? All the social events and all those kinds of things. Is that not something that Jesus would be outraged over? Certainly, I think that it would. And so he said to them in verse 16, he says, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." And it says that his disciples remembered what was prophesied of him, that zeal for his house has eaten him up. Jesus had a passion for God and a passion for God's things, and he had a passion for God's house. I think that's just important for us to learn, to have that kind of zeal, that kind of passion for important things like that. And look at what it says in verse 18. So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show us since you do these things?" That later on in the second time that we'll see the cleansing of the temple, they'll ask, "By what authority do you do these things?" But the whole point of all of this is like, what gives you the right to come into our temple and do these things? And what gives you the right? Where do you get your authority at to do this? That it was their show, it was their place. They were the ones that were in control of it. This was their scene, and look how Jesus answers. He says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Actually, this will become one of the accusations that they try to get to stick in the sham of a trial that they had before the Sanhedrin. That he said that he was going to tear down the temple and he's going to rebuild it in 3 days. They totally did not understand the thing. They totally didn't understand what he was saying in this. The disciples will later on remember what this was about. But the Jews say, well, this took 46 years to build. Now you're going to say that you're going to rebuild it in 3 days. It shows that their misunderstanding of where God was now. The shell of a temple that they were worshiping in, God had already abandoned. God had left. This was no longer where God was. God was dwelling in his Son, and he was amongst them. He was Emmanuel, God with us. But God wasn't in the temple. God had abandoned the temple because they had abandoned God in their religion. Instead, it was Jesus. In fact, the very thing that they do to the temple of Jesus would cause their temple to be destroyed. The fact that they had rejected the Messiah and that they had crucified him, and they had abandoned him, the very fact that they had done that will lead up to their temple being destroyed. Later on, Jesus will announce that the very temple, not one stone will be left upon another. Why was that? Well, he tells lots. He teaches a lot of it around, a lot of parables around that, to say that it was their rejection of him and their abandonment of him that caused their temple to be destroyed. And so the disciples remembered at the resurrection of Jesus Christ in 3 days. They caught on. They understood what he was saying. They remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed. Man, lots of really good lessons for us to take from this. Now, I'll go back to kind of answering what I mentioned previously. I mentioned that this was the first cleansing of the temple. There's lots of debate about this. In fact, if you've ever studied where people want to kind of discredit the Bible, this is one of the things that they might mention. They might say something about how it was not consistent, in the fact that there are 2 different times in which the cleansing of the temple seems to have happened. And I think that's true. I actually think it's true. John's account, remember, we're at the very beginning of his ministry. He had just turned water to wine. That was the first miracle that was done. And right immediately after that, we have the cleansing of the temple. Doesn't seem to line up with the other synoptic gospels, which had it towards the end of his ministry, actually leading right up into his crucifixion. And so how do we figure out how that works? Like, was it at the beginning or was it at the end? And lots of critics will say, well, see, the Bible's not consistent. But that's not true. I think it can be both. It seems as if this one here is different than the one that will be later on. And that makes sense, because would one cleansing actually clear out these people from doing this ever again? Do criminals typically care about whether the cops run them away or not? They're going to come back and they're going to continue to do what they're doing. And so I don't think that's an issue here. I think what we see is that Jesus early on in his ministry was very passionate and zealous towards cleansing the temple. And later on, as they're about to destroy his temple, he's still passionate and zealous as he's seeing the people do things that they shouldn't. They turn this house of prayer, this thing that was meant to be spiritual, the courtyard of the Gentiles, which was meant to be a place in which people went and worship God, they turned it into something that it wasn't supposed to be. An opportunity to make money. And Jesus was extremely angry and mad. And here's the thing, there's just enough differences between the 2 accounts, between the synoptic gospels and what John holds here, to say that these are 2 separate times in which Jesus cleansed the temple. Now, you're welcome to disagree with that or whatever, but I think that's probably the clearest answer that there is. And so we have this first cleansing of the temple. Let's go ahead and read. I'm going to talk about, since it's just a few verses, I'm going to go ahead and cover 23 to 25 as well as we look at this. It says, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when he saw the sign which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself to them because he knew all men and had no need that anyone should testify of a man, for he knew what was in a man. And so there were those in Jerusalem that saw what Jesus did here. They heard him teach afterwards. They heard the things that he said, and they believed in him. But there's something special about Jesus, and you see that as you go through the Gospels. Some of the accusations that they would make about Jesus, that Jesus would be able to answer them just right. He'd be able to say the exact right thing to them that made them even more angry, or that would cause them not to be able to do anything. They would make some kind of accusation or some kind of question that they thought that they could trap him in, and he'd answer it just right. And then they would turn away and they wouldn't do anything at all because he didn't say what they had hoped that he had said. You know, one of the things that I become more and more amazed about, like I always think that the miracles of Jesus was one of the things that caused me to believe in him the most. But I'll tell you what, for me, as I studied the Gospels, the thing that really deepens my belief in him is not so much the miracles, although they are incredible, but it's his teachings. And so there was these people who believed in his name. They saw the signs that he did. They saw this event that happened there in the temple, and heard what he said. But Jesus always knew the hearts of men. Like, he learned how to distinguish between men like Nathaniel, who was a man in which there was honesty. He was an honest man. I remember exactly what he said. Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. He'd be able to distinguish between a man like that and like the Pharisees, who had no honesty within them whatsoever. And so even though some of these people believed, Jesus could distinguish between the two, and he would not commit himself to certain people because he understood what was in their heart. He knew that they were hard-hearted. And so he didn't need anybody to give some kind of testimony, some kind of recommendation for people. He just knew, he just could distinguish between them because he saw what was in their hearts. And so despite some of them believing, there were some that were still just hard-hearted. Some of them just who were just still really unbelieving. Maybe they were more interested in what Jesus could offer them than they were interested in having a zeal and a passion towards what Jesus his purpose to come here to do. Man, there's a lot in this section. There's all kinds of things I'm sure I didn't really touch on as much as I should have, but I hope that's helpful for you. Hope that's something that you can kind of think about, meditate on, and I hope that is something that benefited you this morning, like it did me. So I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. If, by the way, if you didn't see the beginning of this study, you're always welcome to go back and watch the beginning. The recording will show up at some point just a few minutes after we're done here. You can go back and watch it. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, that would be great. Make sure to comment down below the post, and I'll be able to go back and acknowledge or be able to answer questions or anything that anything that's on your mind. So appreciate that, and hope everybody has a great day, and God bless.